Hare Suanda, Cheryl Bear Slee, Natle Weston, Demdenu Slee. My name is Cheryl Bear, and I'm from the village of Natle Wet'en First Nation, which is west of Prince George in British Columbia. I am here today. We're going to be talking about Indigenous theology. And this is a series of videos that is being produced by First United for some different projects involved, but it should be available on the website. And I'm really thrilled to have some really great friends here with me today. I was going to introduce myself and then talk about the land that I'm on. So I like to do the land acknowledgement because I have had some experience when I was younger where people never talked about the land that we're on. They talk about some other land somewhere else. Maybe we learned about the Hurons in grade 6, and the teacher said, I think they're probably extinct. And so it went from being, So to ground ourselves, I like to say that I am currently on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. And I'd like to thank them for letting us do our business on their land. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Sanders.
Hi, I'm Lauren. Lauren Nadishnakas, Mosadam Nishnabe Nadishnakas. I am enrolled Potawatomi. I work at First United as the Indigenous Spiritual Care Chaplain with Cheryl. And the land that I live, work, and play on is the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So let us start with prayer. God, Creator, we thank you. We thank you for all that is around us, all of the abundance. And we ask that your knowledge and wisdom come forth, and that you hold us all in a blanket of love and care and kindness. And we pray this in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Lauren. And also, I forgot to say that I am the community minister for First United, started October of last year, 2020. So I'm going to turn it over to our guests. We also, maybe I'll ask Hubert to introduce himself first. He's one of our guests. He and Lauren are gonna be listening, and then because they are at a VST, we're gonna ask them also to comment and ask questions at the end. So take it away, Hubert.
Hi, yeah, my name is Hubert Barton. I'm of the Nishka Nation that are located in the north coast of British Columbia. I am the youngest of 4 brothers and 1 sister. My Nishka name is Lubait Bashkibu. My parents are Hubert Barton Sr. and the late Benita Barton. I live, work, and play on the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and my official title is the teaching house, the administrative coordinator of the teaching house that moves around, and I'm also doing a lot of the work for the Indigenous Studies program. So thank you for having me today.
Brilliant, thank you, Hubert. We're really glad that you're here. And I'm going to be one of the presenters as well today, but I'm going to ask Ray if he'll introduce himself, our other presenter.
Hi, my name is Ray Aldridge, and the Mohawk gave me a name, Sago Hande Se, which means the one who stands in front, which could be the target or maybe a leader, I suppose, depending on the day. I'm originally from northern Alberta, Treaty 8 territory. My mother was born on the Swan River Cree Band by Lesser Slave Lake, and I was born in Grand Prairie. I've lived in many places. These days, my wife and I live down here in Richmond, British Columbia. I have a daughter who lives close to me with her husband and 2 of my grandchildren. She's a school teacher. And then I have a son who lives in Montreal. And then I have a daughter and a son who live back where my mom still lives in Grand Prairie. And a guest here on the land of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, trying to live in a good way, not be disrespectful. And then I work as the director of the Indigenous Studies program at the Vancouver School of Theology, and also serving as the interim dean, academic dean for the school. And it's my privilege to be here, helping out my good friend Cheryl Bear. Thank you.
And our other presenter, very, very happy to ask Adrian to introduce yourself.
As my first cousin Beverly Jacobs says, my GST name is Adrian Dean Jacobs. Adrian is Italian and it means dark. Dean is leader of 10. And Jacobs is struggler, wrestler. So I relate to all of those names. My clan name is Ganusano, which means Deer Lodge. I'm of the Turtle Clan of the Cayuga Nation, Six Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy, from the Grand River lands in southern Ontario. I live here in Treaty 1 territory that they also refer to as the Stone Fort Treaty, and Anishinaabe traditional territory. And I am the keeper of the circle at Sandy Soto Spiritual Center. I am a father of 5 and grandfather of 3. I just recently had a granddaughter born in January. And I love the hundreds of pictures that I've already seen and the many, many videos of my first granddaughter, Juniper Artemis. So that's me.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm just really thrilled to be in a room with friends and to be able to talk about some really important things. So Indigenous theology has not always been a thing. It's it's kind of new, and it still sort of freaks some people out. And I think it's been for a lot of us Indigenous folks, we've all been on a journey of decolonization. I'm wearing my decolonization sweatshirt today because it's a good journey. It's been a really good journey for me to go on, and I think it's been my whole life a struggle against colonization and trying to decolonize, and just that tug of war that it is. Lately, I've been winning, I feel like. But decolonization always, it always kind of sounds like a big scary word. And people have even told me, oh no, like that sounds terrible. It sounds like you're going to take away everything that I know and love. You're going to change it and you're going to make it into something completely different, and you're going to change my whole life. And I was like, well, that kind of happened to Native people. So, but I don't think that's what we're all about. What we want to do, what decolonization means to me, is it means hearing another story and changing your mind. And so what I always say about decolonization is if you have heard of the residential schools in Canada, and by now, ever since 2008, when the apology came out, not when the settlement was, or the class action suit was won in 2007, but in 2008, most Canadians started to hear about the residential schools. And so I say, if you have heard about the residential schools in Canada, then you have been decolonized, and in a big way. The residential school survivors, they fought for years and years with that suit, and they kept going from court to court to court, all the way up to the top. And so majority of Canadians that I talked to, when they would hear about the residential schools, they would right away get angry, and they would say, how could this happen in Canada? We can never let this happen again. So in that way, you can see that decolonization is really good. It's a really good idea, and we need to keep walking in that way. And people like to talk about the term reconciliation. I would prefer to say decolonization, but reconciliation is also, in my mind, a good word. I take it as a mandate from my elders, the residential school survivor. My mom was a residential school survivor. She went to LeJac. And I take that truth and reconciliation as a mandate. They could have just chosen truth. They could have just said, we're going to take our money and we're out of here. But they chose to, based on the South African model, to go with truth and reconciliation. So that's why I'm interested in talking about that. I like the word. I know that my bros here talk about using the word maybe conciliation rather than reconciliation. Very, very wise. But also I think decolonization is really what I like talking about these days. And I want to decolonize everything. I want everything. Like I want to decolonize Canada, the church, the Bible. And I know that freaks some people out as well. But I've already talked about the ways that Canada has already been decolonized, and the continuance of that would be to dig a little further and to read more and to learn more about history of Canada and the United States from an Indigenous perspective, which is very different from the perspective that has been taught in schools. From our perspective, these countries were not founded on Christian principles, unless you think about the Christian doctrine of discovery. And from our perspective, systemic racism was woven into the founding. It was poured into the founding of Canada and the United States. And there was even a thing, and this was so shocking to me when I learned about it, but there was, in the deep South in the US, when slavery was going on, there was a thing called the slave version of the Bible. And that's where the slave owners thought, well, we were obligated to, missionize the slaves, but we don't want to give them any of the verses that talk about freedom. So they took all of the verses of freedom out of there, and then they gave them that. And so I guess all of Exodus, all of that stuff. So, and why did they do that? Well, because freedom is dangerous. And if it's in the gospel, if it's in the Bible, then it's even more dangerous, because then it's from God. So for Indigenous folks in Canada and the US, we weren't given a colonized version of the Bible, but we were given colonized interpretations. We were given, and so the way of being for the church has been following the example of Canada, that systemic racism rides also in the foundation of the church, unfortunately. And you can ask any Indigenous person in that, they will say, yeah, they have experienced racism in church. We always kind of get the sort of the side eye when you're going into church. I don't know, you guys try to give me your best side eye. Hey, yeah, you've gotten those before, I can tell. So it's so sad trying to make something so unhappy and kind of lighthearted. But we go into churches as Indigenous people, and sometimes we go into speakers, and I've had friends who say, people come up to them and say, oh, we didn't know Indians could be Christians. We didn't know Indians could be smart. Stuff like that. Like we hear all of that stuff in church. And we get also that people come to us and talk about our land being full of darkness, and our beadwork, our art, our instruments, they're all evil. And the whole saying, when in doubt, do without. And our spirituality is suspect at best. But so this decolonization of the church for Indigenous people, this is so important to have some of those things uprooted and taken out. And I've even heard professors of seminaries say things like, when it comes to African culture in the church or Asian culture in the church, and especially Indigenous culture in the church, they'll say, we don't want any culture in the church. And these are professors. And I always want to answer, and a couple times I've been able to, but sometimes there's no time or opportunity. But I always want to answer, yes, you know what, you're right. We shouldn't have culture in the church, especially the two most insidious cultures that have been permeating the church for hundreds of years, and that's Canadian and American culture. We should have far less of that in the church. And let's really take a look at that, because we don't think about Canadian or American as church or a culture in the church, because we just call that church. So some of those things, having a real careful look, second look at some of these things. The last thing that I want to talk about decolonizing is the Bible. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that there was a slave version of the Bible, and our sort of the interpretations that were given, or the applications that were given from sermons or from Bible studies, from Bible schools, the interpretation for Indigenous people always has the justice taken out of it. And again, when for freedom for a slave is dangerous. So justice for Indigenous people is also dangerous. It wasn't until hanging out with some of these, some of my colleagues here, but other Indigenous leaders from across Canada and the United States in the last 25, 30 something years, it wasn't until then that I started hearing about these new ways of reading the Bible. So reading about John the Baptist and saying, him and Jesus are first cousins, but to Native people, we'd say brother and sister, or brothers. I have my first cousin is here in Vancouver. Their baby's in Children's Hospital, and he's my first cousin, but he's my brother. Like, we're really, really close. So that's, in ancient cultures, I imagine it was somewhat similar. And so Jesus' brother, John the Baptist, was executed by an oppressive, domineering government that wanted to eradicate their people. Nobody said that kind of stuff when I was growing up. Nobody talked about the Bible, that kind of an interpretation to me as an Indigenous person, because we didn't want to have any of the justice in there, because we didn't want, and this is something that Native leaders hear all the time. In fact, I had a leader who wanted me to sign a contract that said I would not say anything political, because when it comes to land, or it comes to like that oppressive government stuff, that's political and that's not okay in the church. So always finding ways to sort of shackle us in that sense, and having the gospel weaponized against Indigenous people to say, and this was in the residential schools was so evident, where they said you could be a better Christian if you would just be less Native, you'd just be less Indigenous, and that weaponized gospel, that'll hold somebody down better than a gun. So to decolonize the Bible, I think we need to stop reading ourselves into the story as the hero all the time. And because sometimes we're the oppressor. Sometimes you can be the oppressor in that story. And I think thinking about, the Roman government in Jesus' day, and Jesus in the upper room and the disciples, and they're sort of hiding out, and they're sort of, some stuff is going on politically there. But to sort of, like every Christian, we have to sort of rethink where we are in the story, because most every Christian sees themselves as in the upper room with Jesus. We all relate to that, and it's called, like, that's our spiritual, what is it? We're being persecuted for our faith. And some folks, Lower Mainland here, they're fighting against Bonnie Henry's orders, and they're saying we're being persecuted for our faith. And so they always can relate to Jesus in the upper room. Whereas I kind of feel like that story, I see myself in that story now far more after hearing and learning so much about the injustices over my lifetime, the injustices that have happened to Indigenous people here. So the Roman government is far more, from my perspective, like the Canadian government, like the American government, when it comes to Indigenous people. So decolonization is not scary. It feels to me like telling the truth. Like I said, hearing a different story and changing your mind about it. And when there's truth is spoken, because John 14:6, Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." And when truth is spoken, something of Jesus is always in it. Thank you for listening to my part, and I'm going to turn it over to my bro, Ray Aldridge.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm gonna jot down the time so I don't go on forever. Although some of the West Coast tribes have stories that last for 3 days, so I won't do that. I won't last 3 days, I hope. And then Cheryl says this could be a cure for insomnia, so we'll see what happens. Now, first of all, I was going to talk about treaty because actually the TRC calls to action. They believe that treaty, understanding Indigenous treaty, was key to reconciliation. So, and they also said that the thing that needed to happen in Canada, all the way through, like over this 30-year process, that was the journey of reconciliation so far. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because, every 30 years, the church has to reinvent itself, because that's about how long a generation is sort of, if you think about it, you get really hit your stride probably when you're around 35, and then 30 years later, you hit 65. And, then you think, oh, maybe I'm too old to do this anymore. Some of us just keep going and going and going. But the idea is you have to hand this on. So that's kind of why I think that's one of the reasons we continue to do this, because we worked hard at reconciliation. We were there at different meetings. I remember back in 95, many of us were at the sacred assembly that Elijah Harper called to seek a spiritual solution. And then many of us were at different things. We were all there a year after the apology. Cheryl Bear was there. Adrian wasn't, but I called him and I said, Adrian, what do I ask Chuck Strahl, the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs? And Adrian said, ask him what non-assimilation policies look like, because they confessed to having assimilationist policies and they weren't going to do that anymore. Ask him what non-assimilation policies look like. And I also asked him, so what does repentance look like for Canada? And one of the things that it looks like, the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, it looks like returning to the treaties and trying to live out that relationship. I remember Cheryl was there too. And we had a meeting with Paul Martin. I think it was that trip. Paul Martin, former Prime Minister Paul Martin, asked us, why would you Indigenous people, you guys still follow Jesus, even in spite of the residential schools? And I remember Cheryl said, well, because he's God. And I laughed. I thought it was a good answer. She said much more than that, but that's the part I remember. So we've been on this journey for 30 years. I hope that through these things, you'll join us in that journey. Many of you are, and maybe this will help. Maybe this will help. So I wanted to talk about the treaties, but to understand the treaties, you really understand at least Cree spirituality, the spirituality of the Northern Plains. It's wrapped up in our creation stories, because our creation story tells us how we're related to the earth, that the Creator put us in particular places. That's why we always say we're on these people's territory, because the Creator put them there. That gives them a special place. One of the things that they talked about at the Sacred Assembly that Elijah Harper called, they said it a few times, that we're responsible. We're responsible because the Creator has put us here. And that's one of the things, even in the Genesis account, the second creation account in Genesis 2, the Creator says to human beings, he says, you're responsible. Take care of this garden. Take care of this. We're responsible. And that's what we're trying to do. So spirituality is all wrapped up in land. It's all wrapped up in understanding your creation story, and your creation story tells how you're related to the earth. Spirituality is not like religion. One of the problems with the West that Cheryl talks about, one of the problems with the colonization and in the dominant Western European approaches is religion is this other thing, but that doesn't exist in the Cree language, the word for religion. There's no word for religion because a person was to live their whole life trying to live out this harmony that existed in the land and creation, that you looked around, you say, hey, this is a good land. That's kind of what you do. This is what's kept me through this pandemic time, is I look out and I say, this is a good land. It's a good land. And now that there's not so many people driving around, the eagles are coming back, and the different things, you can see more of them, which is always nice. Reminds me of the bumper sticker. The better I get to know people, the more I like my dog. No, I'm kidding. And so spirituality is about the way that we live. And it's evaluated by the community. So our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren, they will evaluate our spirituality based upon how we lived out our story with the land. That's what will judge us in the future. And so, because it's related to the land, and because all of our ceremonies, at least for the Northern Plains Cree, almost all the ceremonies are connected with place, with land, and about maintaining or celebrating the harmony that exists. And because of that, and because there were so many things changing with the coming of the Europeans, then we made treaty. It was a way, especially by the time it reached the Northern Plains, it was a way to try to create meaningful space for these different peoples to exist, to coexist in this space and maintain this harmony that was created. Because our land, the land and our identity is all tied up with the land. For the Cree, the word we use for land is aski, and that word can mean many things. It's the word that's used in the Cree translation of John 3:16. So when you back translate it from Cree, it would be, God so loved the land that he gave his only son. The land, it's very important. This connection with land is why homelessness is such a significant problem for Indigenous people. Even though we moved around a lot, that didn't mean we didn't have relationship with land. Homelessness is about when all the relationships are cut off and people are alone, and they have no place that they call home. And for no other reason, you should support First United, because they're out there trying to support people, maintain a connection, and be properly related to other people and with the land. Homelessness was a significant problem. So we were trying to maintain the harmony. So we made treaty to try to maintain those relationships and deal with the effect of things going wrong. And things did happen that were not positive. There was a lot of disease that came when the Europeans came. Just like when there was a pandemic not long after Constantine declared Christianity the kingdom of the Roman Empire, there was a big pandemic that went through, devastated a lot of people. And now there is a pandemic we're dealing with, but when the Europeans came, there was a pandemic of smallpox and tuberculosis. It decimated our people. So we made treaty in part because things were not going good, and we were trying to do something to heal the land, to try to return harmony or maintain harmony, or try to create some positive way to go forward. This continues to exist in Canada. The sacred laws from the Creator. I've heard that on the West Coast. They're very aware of that. But John Burroughs, who writes about Indigenous law, says creation stories are part of Indigenous law, and treaties flowed from a sacred source. And they existed in Canada before the coming of the Europeans. A great example is the Haudenosaunee. They understood about relationship with one another, and I'm not an expert from it, but I always admire this 5 nations and the 6 nations. It existed in Canada before the coming of the Europeans. For the Cree, treaty was about harmony. And what's significant for the church is that the priests and the missionaries were present at the signing of the treaties, especially the numbered treaties. You know, after the treaties got going, probably one of the earliest ones was the Truro Wampum Treaty that the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations, signed with the Dutch, and later transferred that to the British. They came under that treaty as well. But when the numbered treaties were happening across the northern Ontario, Winnipeg, a little bit of northern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Edmonton, or Alberta, and then the priests and missionary were present at the signing of those treaties, and they encouraged First Nations because it encouraged the First Nations peoples, because the crown officials who were making treaty, they called upon God, often using these priests. I always say that's an example of why the church is actually a guarantor of the treaties, the numbered treaties anyways. And the First Nations were also encouraged because the newcomers stopped negotiating on the Lord's Day, which encouraged the Indigenous people. So they thought, I guess history will bear it out, that whether it was true, but they thought that these people really understood the sacredness of making an agreement like the treaty. They thought that's what they were doing. Treaty 6, the treaty commissioner recorded in his journal what the Indigenous people thought. They said, when they were telling the people later, when they were relating the story, they said, when finally agreed upon treaty, the commissioner took the promises in his hands and raised them to the skies and placed the treaties in the hands of Gitsmantu, the great mystery. This was how we understood treaty. And we believed that that the Creator was present with us, and that the Creator would hold the participants of the treaty, that the Creator would hold them to that treaty. The treaty was between Crown, the First Nations, and the Creator. They took part, the Europeans took part in the treaty. They, in the treaty ceremonies, they took part in the pipe ceremony, which invoked the presence of the Creator. The talks were sacred, and to violate them would invite illness, because that pipe ceremony was part. But the Europeans, all the guys present, they all took part of that, including the priests. They also took part in the sweetgrass ceremony, probably, the making relatives ceremony of the Lakota, the Dakota, and Nakota. And the Crown entered into family relationships, so much so that after the signing of Treaty 4, Kakishawe, who was one of the signers of the treaty, he saw the newly appointed lieutenant governor, who happened to be the son-in-law of the queen. He'd married one of the queen's daughters. And Kakishawe saw him and he said, "How's my brother-in-law today?" Because Kakishawe believed that he had become a child of, or a son of, the queen through the treaty, and that this man he knew was a son of the queen by marriage. So he said to this Englishman, this newly appointed public servant, "How's my brother-in-law today?" And it tells us the understanding that the Indigenous people had. Again, the presence of the missionaries and the priests said that they were guarantors of the treaty. That means we can't just dismiss the treaties in Canada. Their sacred and permanent relationships were established. The treaty commissioner used the great spirit as justification for the right use of land. So then at one point, Henry Morris says to the Indigenous people, I think it was when negotiating Treaty 6, he said, the Creator made the world, the land for everybody. And the Indigenous people agreed. They said, that's right. That's right. They didn't disagree. The commissioner also said, we're not like the Americans. We're not making some 25-year contract. We are making a covenant. This covenant will last as long as the rivers run, as long as the grass grows, as long as the sun shines. And the covenant was not merely in the written words on the paper. This was a sacred agreement that was to be renewed every year, which is the way Indigenous treaties function. Every year you were to renew them through gifts and through ceremony. Oral tradition says that when some of those signers of the treaty, Norm Wesley told me this from up by Moose, he's from Moose Factory. He said, the elder said to him that when they put the X in syllabics, that's the sign of Christ. And that's what they were putting down when they signed that X, that Christ, that the Creator was present when they were signing those treaties. One of the problems in British Columbia is that the government of Canada, ever since the beginning, even though I think some of those treaty officials who made treaty were sincere, the government of Canada quickly denied the covenant view and saw them just as a contract, as a way of eradicating Indigenous rights to land. One of the good things about acknowledging that in British Columbia, in Vancouver, we sit on unceded territory. That means it was stolen. It was taken unlawfully. British Columbia got away with it because John A. Macdonald really wanted his railway built to the coast. So because even today, some of these comprehensive claim settlements the government's trying to push on Indigenous people see it as a way to eradicate and eliminate Indigenous title to land. And the First Nations are right in British Columbia to oppose this, because it's seen as an attempt to extinguish First Nations as peoples and as the connection to the land. Some Indigenous people, though, made British Columbia or Canada sign treaty in a good way. For example, the Nishka Treaty, as they understand these things that I've talked about. Treaty is really talking about Stan Beardy, who was Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, Northern Ontario. He said to me one time, we were having a meal in Thunder Bay, and he said, treaty affirms a few things. It affirms that everyone should be able to have a peaceful existence in our territories. And treaty is about that, a peaceful existence. Treaty also affirms access to the land. Nobody has a right to cut anyone off from being properly related with creation. Treaty also affirms the importance of everyone being able to have something to eat, to be able to share in the bounty of the land. And treaty also affirms, and I think the Truro Wampum Treaty is probably the best example of this, the right to be who the Creator made us to be. And no one has the right to take that away from us as Indigenous people, just like we don't want to make anyone else different. Well, maybe a little different. I guess that's why we're doing the video, right, Cheryl? Just maybe a little different. Treaty, very important. I think that every year we should affirm that God wants us to live in this creation. The Creator wants us to live like relatives. to talk about the hard things and always try to heal the damage that happens, because that happens. But in the end, remember, we do this for our grandchildren, and they'll judge us whether or not we lived out our spirituality the way that we said. We said we were spiritual people, and how we lived in relationship with the land and the land that we left to our children and grandchildren. That'll testify to whether or not we truly were spiritual people or we were just talking, just making noise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Appreciate all your good words. I'm going to turn it over to Adrian now.
Thank you, Ray. I always really appreciate what you have to say. And Cheryl, thank you for a good introduction to what we're talking about here. One of the things that people ask me often, non-Indigenous folk, is what can I do? They'll hear of the change in life for us. They'll hear of our culture and the things that were helpful and healing for us, and how that was disturbed. And people's consciences are stricken by it and ashamed of it and feeling guilty as well. And then they, from a place of seeming helplessness, they say, what can I do? And so I would like to just talk a little bit about the idea of who we are in terms of our identity and being. I remember early in my Christian faith that there was this language of filling the emptiness with God, or the idea of a God-shaped void, or the idea that that addictions were evidence of you trying to put into that God-shaped void some other alternative. And I thought about my own life. I grew up at the Six Nations Reserve, which is the largest reserve in Canada. It also has the largest, percentage-wise, I think, intact traditional culture. And so I grew up with my father as a faith keeper there, and my mother as an Anglican. And we went to the ceremonies with my dad, and occasionally to weddings and funerals with my mother. And I grew up in a home with both of these spiritual influences. And after many years of following the Christian way and trying to understand my experience, I thought to myself, I have never felt empty. I've never felt what has been referred to as a God-shaped void. I felt other things. I felt pain. I felt violation. I felt dreams die. I felt happiness and ecstasy and all kinds of feelings, but I've never felt empty. And I thought about my life and how that I was, born to loving parents from two different traditions who were sober. Both of them were Cayuga. Both of them were from our community. And I grew up in a good setting and a loving place where there was not any yelling, there was not any alcoholism, there was not any violence in my home. And how that I had that kind of experience. And so I think sometimes people have this idea that when you come to Christ, that there's this throwing away of everything old and a embracing of everything new that is very unrealistic. It's not a realistic way of approaching life. And I thought about the difference between that Western kind of Christianity that I was inculcated into and compared it to my upbringing and my life and my Christian experience, and how differing it was from that kind of language of emptiness. And one of the traditions that our people have is the Thanksgiving address, and it is a greeting and a thanking of creation. And it is sometimes a very extensive greeting. It can be over an hour in the language. And it is a greeting of all of the elements of life as relative. And there's a reference to the earth as mother. And in addressing our mother, the earth, the term for future generations is called, the translation of the Haudenosaunee language term for that is faces that come from the ground. So the idea of faces coming from the ground, as human beings, we have this ability to recognize faces. We have the ability to recognize identity and notice small nuances of emotion and feeling. And it's identity that comes from the earth, just like the scriptures describing the first human, the first Adam, the first earth being coming from the ground, that identity came from the ground, that shaping of that face, that body came from the ground. And when I think about it, I think that my experience in life is that very thing, that out of the ground of my mother and father, I have been born into this world. And so that I have this rootedness, this connection to this earth that is, and Susie McPherson Durendi, our keeper of the learning circle here at Sandy Soto, often quotes one of the theologians, Western theologians, that had an understanding of connection to creation by stating that the creation, the earth, the creation is our first Bible. It's our first communication from the divine. And so I have that connection. I have that right from the very beginning. And I have appreciated Terry LeBlanc when he looked at the idea of spirituality. And he said the problem with Western theology is that it begins with the fall in Genesis chapter 3. It begins with the garden and with the original sin as it has been conceived in Western theology. And I even heard one very strong person who was rooted in that kind of theology telling me that I need to teach my people all about sin so that they can have an appreciation for Jesus who comes to save them from that sin. And I think even Jonathan Edwards was surprised because he was of that kind of theology of trying to communicate the sinfulness of human beings and their need for Christ. When he was preaching, he began to tell the creation story, Genesis chapter 1. And while he was telling the Bible story of creation, he said the native people began to weep. They began to cry. And some even fell on the ground. And they were moved. And their hearts were made tender in ways that he was hoping to be made tender through the avenue of guilt. He wanted to make them feel guilty for their sin, and their heart would be softened so that they could invite Christ in to this void in their life. When they heard the goodness of God, they melted and they became open to that message of the goodness of God. And so to me, that creation message was heard by our people very clearly. And when it came to them in the text of Scripture, it had that very same comforting voice that they recognized from creation. They understood creation to be dangerous. Animals will kill you. The rivers can bash your head and destroy you. You have to be careful cutting down trees. They don't fall, the way you want them all the time. And once they fall, they could bounce and they could crush you. So we understood that there was this respect that you needed to accord creation, but they also heard the loving care of that creation. And so for me, I look back on my life and I see I'm rooted into the earth. I'm rooted into that message. I wasn't missing that message. And that when the message of Christ came, it was analogous. It was something that was confirming of that very place of identity with the earth. And so Christ was naturally seen in my eyes as an expression of that goodness, the goodness of creation. And then out of that nurture of a mother, the earth is referred to as mother. And in the Haudenosaunee society, women are and this feminine life and energy is seen as the very source of being, the very source of well-being, that even in that very deep nurturing of the mother is the voice of conscience. That voice that is so deep within us that we don't know where it comes from. It's kind of like the voice of our elders. In Western society, we say, when we say, and the elder said, Western society says, what elder? When did they say it? Where is it written down? Give me the reference. and our reference is lost in time because it's not important which elder. It's the fact that the elders have spoken, and we recognize the voice of wisdom in those elders. Just like the voice of conscience is that voice of female nurturing within us. And so I had that from my parents, from both traditions, from my father in his longhouse traditional religion, and from my mother and her care and her understanding of her Christian faith. And so for me, identity has always been about being a human being and not some superstar. I'll close by giving a story that was told, and it's very common when there is a healing circle of folks in the church with church members and Native people there, like the TRC, where Native people share their story. My people often cry in hearing those horrible stories, and they're moved very deeply. And they sense the value of this. One of my friends has been in a circle for many, many years. And the problem that she's encountering with this circle is that the white people see themselves as saviors, see themselves as, I'm from the church and I'm here to help. Just like people say, I'm from Indian Affairs and I'm here to help. I'm from the government, I'm here to help. It's this idea of white saviorism, where there's no vulnerability. There's no openness of sharing your own need and your own brokenness. And because people don't share their own brokenness and willingness to receive from the circle, all of the Native people just disappeared. There's only one left who is brave enough to stay in that circle because of this there's something about this failure to be human and accept yourself as a human being and not be always presenting yourself as some kind of help to somebody else. And so my thought has always been egalitarianism and egalitarian leadership is all about being willing to be human in reference to other people and not trying to come across as a savior. I don't really need your best impression of what you think I need. I need you, good, bad, and ugly, whatever you are. I don't need your best impression. And some Native people or some non-Native people want to so identify with Native people. I think, don't give me your best impression of me. Be who you are and offer that to me. That's reciprocity. That's where something really good can come forth in our working together. So don't come to our community as a savior, but don't be afraid of what you have to offer either. Don't just stand back and say, I can't share. And I'll close with this final little poem that I did one time at the spur of the moment. I remember somebody asked that question, what should we do? What can we do? A white person. Cheryl went on and on and on and on with an answer. On and on and on. And so I took the mic after her and I thought, I don't need to do that. So I said this, I said, listen to our story until you are reduced to a puddle of tears and stay there until God resurrects you. And when God resurrects you and you stand up, you'll be holding hand in hand with us. So that's my piece.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Ray. Good words. I really appreciate all of the wisdom. Yes, I'm going to open it up now for Lauren and Hubert for comments, questions. We might have answered every question. You are now rendered questionless because of
Right.
no. But I'll turn it over to you guys. Maybe I'll ask Lauren to go first.
Hey, so just maybe to give a recap of what I heard, to give Hubert some time if he has any questions formulated. But so Cheryl presented first, and she shared the value of decolonization, that hearing a different story and changing your mind about it is the key to the process of decolonization that we are all taking part in as people living on the land that's called Canada. And she also challenged everyone to read the Bible as though you are the oppressor. See yourself, place yourself in the scriptures as the oppressor rather than the hero. Ray spoke about harmony and how treaties can be lived as lifting up harmony, and that harmony is spirituality, because your whole life and your relationship with the land all are a part of how you reach that harmony. And then he talked about how the treaties have gone through being seen as covenantal relationships to contracts, and talked about how here in British Columbia, unceded really tells the story, that there's a bigger story behind that word here in Vancouver, that connects how the covenant of treaties turned into a contract, and then that contract was even devalued more. And that unceded tells the story of stolen land. We talked about how, then Adrian talked about how where we can put ourselves as Christians going forth. Not to be seen as the hero or the helper or the savior, but also not to be filled with guilt, and that guilt that that the guilt of sin won't. I think I liked when you said the guilt of sin didn't make hearts tender. And so the hard work for particularly white Christians is to find that balance between seeing creation as good, seeing ourselves as good, seeing what God has made as good, and then also understanding that the guilt of sin doesn't take away our worth, that we are in between, that God has created us as good. And the need for reciprocity, that in order to find solidarity or to go deeper than charity might go, that it's important that we have authentic people seeking authentic relationships, and that reciprocity is what you can do. The work that you do internally on understanding who you are as a child of God, and taking those authentic sense of self and coming into authentic relationships with people, with Indigenous folks. That is what you can do when you ask what you can do about decolonization. So I hope I gave a good recap for the three of you awesome people. Hubert, did you have any questions that you wanted to lift up that maybe our viewers might be thinking of asking themselves?
Thank you. I liked how you ended there, Cheryl, when you said you might have been rendered questionless, because every time when I was listening to Ray and I was listening to all of you guys, and every time I was like, oh, I have a question. Like a couple of seconds later, oh, that question would be answered. Oh, I have another question. Maybe this would be good to ask. Oh, nope, he answered that question too. Then nope, he said something that had me very intrigued. Okay, never mind. Ray, Adrian answered it instead. So I just find that so fascinating how that works, and it is pretty amazing. But I really wanted to thank you for your sharing. Like it is an honor to be able to sit here in you guys' presence and listen to you guys share your thoughts and on everything. And the things that really jumped out to me the most, I do have some comments on the things that really jumped out to me the most, especially when Ray was sharing, when you were talking about living out the relationship and the spirituality is wrapped up in the land, maintaining harmony and treaty, and how that would lead to like family. I really appreciated that story, how when that treaty was signed, he said, how's my brother doing? I was like, yep, that sounds about right. And the thing that just really jumped out to me was just how that all these things, it's almost like they have a pulse to them. They're alive, and because it has a pulse to it, because it's alive and it has a heartbeat, that it needs to be cared for, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be shown love. Otherwise, it won't survive. And I just found that so fascinating when you're talking about your treaties and the land. And for Adrian, and you're talking about how your identity is formed. Our identity is of the earth, and creation is our first Bible, and how you're talking about Mother Earth and it's the voice of wisdom. I have a bad habit of missing my lunch breaks because I'm constantly answering the next thing, the next alert, the next Hubert, need this Hubert, that I work through my lunch break. That today at worship, we had community worship today for work, and I told myself, Hubert, I was like, Hatwit means stop in Nishka. But when I said it out loud, I heard the voice of my mother. I heard the voice of my aunties. I heard the voice of my grandmother telling me to you need to stop for a second and just be. And so I could relate to all those, and just the idea of Indigenous, just to say out loud, Indigenous theology is a pretty amazing thing, and just the need for decolonization and all that. I guess my question I have is because when we said the word decolonize or decolonization, people tend to start to shake in their boots a little. People get a little bit antsy and a little bit nervous because it can be a heavy word, but it can also be very life-giving and rewarding. So I guess I'd like to know, for you guys, what has been the most life-giving or rewarding part of seeing things in a new way through Indigenous eyes, through Indigenous ways of knowing and being?
Yeah, I have described colonization as being some other group coming into a territory, imposing their values and systems upon a community, and then taking their leaders and their authority and removing it to some colonial place. And I said decolonization is restoring that place of authority. So educationally, politically, back to the land, skill-based, food sovereignty, all of those things that helped us flourish on the land to begin with. And so I was challenged one time by a lady in a church after I talked about the Caledonia land claim issue. And I'd spoken in many churches, but this was the only person who really got in my face and challenged me. And she was probably in her late 70s. And so here is an elder, non-Indigenous elder, speaking to me, and she says it very sharply. What do you need with all that land? Or what do you want with all that land? I was surprised by that. But I responded and I said, the same thing you want with it. I want to feed my children. I want to have a future for my grandchildren. I want them to be able to live well in the earth. That's what I want the land for, just like you. And I was like, okay, that didn't come from me. That came from an inspiration at the moment because I wanted to say otherwise. But I respected my non-Indigenous elder.
Ray, do you want to go ahead and answer Hubert's question?
Life-giving about I would keep wanting to say decolonoscopy, but that's not right. Hey, but it's good for you. It's good for you. You need to have that done on a regular basis. No, I'm kidding. The whole thing for me, if you think about in terms of the recovery field, I think that for many generations, it's been like an addict, addicted to power, addicted to, getting more and more, and it's never enough, and addicted to those things. And one of the life-giving things about decolonization was a friend of mine said to me one time, Indigenous friend, we were driving around, and he said, how come you always ask, goes back to what Adrian says, how come you always ask, what should you do? What should you do? How come you never ask, who am I? Who should I be? And that was an Indigenous question. And it stopped me because I realized, you get caught up in our capitalist, world, and it's just all about what you do. It's all about what you do. And you never think about who you really are and understanding who you are. So So I just think the idea of decolonization is the opportunity to live in a new way. And for an addict, the idea that you could take responsibility and begin to take some steps, slow steps to try to heal and live in a new way, that's life-giving, I think. For me, it's been life-giving to think about those things. So, yeah. I'll stop there before I say something really foolish.
Thank God. That's I appreciate those good words. My goodness. So my thinking about what's life-giving about decolonization is, I think, I don't know. I think the colonization is death to Indigenous people in a lot of ways. You know, the history of colonization has been long. It's from, it goes way back from when the settlers came. and the residential schools were sort of this like funnel channel of all of that energy onto Indigenous babies, and so hurt the Indigenous identity. So to start talking about things and changing those things, and my mom was one of the residential school survivors who she passed away a year and a half ago, but she was one of the ones who couldn't talk about the residential schools, like didn't really have a grasp of how bad they were. She was like, it wasn't that bad for me. I didn't have a mom, so I learned things, and then it was only in the last year of her life that other things started to come up, and that's how that sort of happens. I've heard that so many different times, that our elders, on their deathbed, they start talking about some of the bad things that happen. And it's almost like the grip of colonization, or whatever that is, that identity, that harassment, that bullying that they underwent from priests and nuns and government officials, that just held them, like shackled them in place. And so when I, growing up, and I hear from church people that, my earrings are evil and the land is dark, and I'm like feeling all of that, like, and I'm feeling like there's something inherently wrong with me as an Indigenous person. And I walk into churches feeling like a second-class citizen, and like I'm always get that horrible side eye. And so to hear these things, that the land is not dark, to hear back in the day Richard Twist say they wanted us to trade our sin-stained culture for their sin-stained culture, and to sort of like balance the or level the playing field in a sense. That was freedom to me. Because I had felt a lot like Adrian. I felt like when I was in Notlay, and people would say, oh, I feel the oppression, missionaries would say that. And I would feel like, where? Like, I'm a horrible Christian because I don't feel any of that stuff. Like, I feel good when I come here. I feel like relief when I drive onto the land, like my mom did. Like, we're home free. And I felt like the land was beautiful and good. And there was pain and shame involved. And it wasn't always perfect, but there was this sense of place. And another thought that I I always had whenever I drive into Notlay, I always sort of relax and I sort of sigh. And I started wondering, when I moved back there to take the council job, I wondered if that would go away, and it never did. And then I sort of thought, is it because I know all the homes here? There's only 300 so people there. Is it because I know where everybody lives and who they all are and how they're related to me and so on? Or how we're friends or whatever. And then I just started thinking, maybe it's the land itself. And we say that we've been on the land time immemorial. That's something we all say about our land. We always go back to our land to be buried. And so in a very real scientific sense, the land is made of our ancestors from time immemorial. So I feel like now, and I don't know how to wrap my head around this theologically, but I feel like when I drive onto the land, I relax and I sigh, and I feel like also the land sighs and says, you're home. And it welcomes me. The land somehow welcomes me. My ancestors there welcome me. And I feel that real strong connection. It's like a thin place for me, like they say in Celtic religions or spirituality. So that's sort of my thinking, is decolonization has helped me so much. I don't know if I would have survived if I could, like I always say about my view of God, that, he was a very angry God that I was introduced to, and only became a Christian because I didn't want to go to hell, where they were kept yelling about. So, because you can't stay in a relationship with someone who's always mad at you. So that same kind of thing that I don't think I would have, stuck around very long with the ways of thinking that were put onto me. But I wanted to comment on Adrian's, when you talked about the God-shaped hole. I'd always heard about that, in different circles. It's funny how those kind of things can go through the church. And I like what you had to say about it, that you never felt that you had that. You never felt you had something missing. It was really cool. And I think another thing that happens to us has happened to us as Indigenous people was, and I think it might have been from, I don't know where I picked this up, but I remember starting to think about how we don't ever hear how Indigenous people are created in the image of God. We were all like, you're all created in the image of God, but we're assuming that image is that white Jesus. And so it's kind of like the image of God is like very Euro, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. And so I remember one of the first times I said this was in actually in your territory, Hubert. It was in, oh goodness, the place of the skulls. What's the name?
Kincola.
Yes, beautiful. Yes, I love that. I love the land there. And I remember I was in a church and I was doing my singing, talking thing that I did. And there was an elder there who'd been a Christian for a long time. And I spoke, and I said, we never hear this. So I said, Nishka, you are created in the image of God. And then downstairs we were eating salmon sandwiches. God bless everyone who gives me a salmon sandwich. But we were having refreshments downstairs, and I sat with her, and she told me, I have never heard those words in my life, that Nishka are created in the image of God. And I thought, oh my goodness, yeah, I never heard that either. And it's because nobody believed it. And that's part of that systemic racism. Nobody believes that we're created in the image of God. Like, so all of that stuff, breaking down some of these walls and bringing healing to places that were, empty, so on. So, and also wanted to comment on Ray's treaty talk. I think that when you said that our people saw the treaties as between Europeans, Indigenous, and the Creator, like I echo what Hubert said, that bumps it up into another level of seriousness. If the Creator is involved in this, like that's, you don't want to mess with that. So yeah, I think treaty is something that I'm not one of the BC First Nations that we don't have a treaty. We walked away from the treaty process because we just saw how steeped it was in systemic racism and how it was just meant to take. And it was like, I don't know how, it's so funny to me that they just love to separate, sort of silo us over here. Okay, we're going to talk to you. We're those guys over there. Don't worry about them. A little bit to the west of you, but don't worry about them. We'll just talk, don't worry about the old treaties in the east. We're just going to, but yeah, so treaty, and then all the connections to the land. I love this talk about the land. And land is identity. We don't ever introduce ourselves as, what we do. We always start with where we're from, and that's that identity. So any more questions, Hubert, Lauren?
I did. I had some questions.
Or comments?
So also just to say, my spirit hurts every time I hear that the land is dark and that is a bad thing. God created darkness just as God created light. And the Song of Solomon says black is beautiful. So yeah, our ideas about darkness being bad, that was never intended. God created. But things like this, saying truths like that, that we've all heard Cheryl and Ray and Adrian say are hard, are difficult. And so is having a connection to the land. A lot of non-Indigenous folks will maybe balk at those words, having a connection to the land, because they don't know what that means. And I know that you all have talked about in greater understanding what that means. So how do you respond, or what kind of resources can you point to? Because I know Ray always has a book list in his mind, but what kind of where would you guide someone to who is having trouble, you know, letting go of the lie of colonization, letting go of all of those systemic lies that they have built, you know, their own lives on? How do you help someone turn towards truth telling? And how do you guide someone in having connections to the land? So, you know, all the things. I just want to know.
I would suggest that people look up their family trees and go visit the graveyards and show the respect to their ancestors who have made it possible for them to exist and be. In my life, I have regularly done that, visited my relatives' graves, visited my in-laws' graves, and I've taken my children there as well, and have little moments of, it's like devotion. It's a recognition of their life and stories of their life. And I think that if people could recognize that that's where they come from, that is they're actually looking down at the ground. And that's one way to build a consciousness of connection to the earth. One way, anyways.
Hey, if you want books, I've seen this book. It's been out for a while, but it's Greg Polzer and Ken Coates, From Treaty People to Treaty Nation, a roadmap for all Canadians. And so that's a book. And their whole premise, I think, is that, look, you got to draw something. The whole idea, so modernity, like in the modern era, what we, you know, and it's still, post-modernity is really just modernity out of control. But what we kept thinking that, oh, we'll invent something new. So every time something happens, then we have this habit. And it's probably been going in the church since the Reformation. Instead of one pope, now we got 1 million popes, maybe 1 billion popes. But the idea is that they just, oh, we'll just start over again. We'll just start over again. Well, Coates and his co-author Polzer, they say, you can't just keep saying, let's start over again. An Indigenous way is, look, we need to kind of go back to, oh, sorry about that. Siri just wanted to help out too. So the idea was that, you know, you gotta, we have this in our past. And New Zealand is a good example for us. New Zealand's probably 20, 30 years ahead of us in its relationship. And they're a treaty nation. They have a treaty and they recognize that their identity as New Zealanders really lies in that treaty. And one thing that could happen in Canada, I always think, is that my proposal was that in another talk, I talked about how we need a new narrative. We need a new story, because the old story about how these guys came across the ocean and got lost and somehow still, you know, that doesn't work anymore. But we need a new shared narrative, and somehow treaty could be part of that narrative, I think. So there's a good From Treaty People to Treaty Nation. Some other resources that you can access free of charge, and, you know, That's always good, right? So then is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People was the first attempt at reconciliation, but all of those volumes are available online. You can download them for free. There's also the with the Statement of Reconciliation in 1998 by Jane Stewart. They also began the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, started around then, and all of those documents all are online, like suicide prevention, a bunch of studies about different effects of residential school. Those are all available. Good, they're really good stuff, and you can download all those for free just by searching Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And then, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all their documents, and you can listen to the stories. And what happens when you listen to the stories of what happened to people in the residential school, when they tell their stories, and you begin to feel that it's what Adrian pointed out to that's what needs to happen. It reduces you to tears, but those emotions are what God has given us to provide energy for us to actually change. So it gives us the strength to actually change. So those are the resources I could think off the top of my head that you can have. We should, if we had a piece of cloth, we could sell it to you or something. No, I'm kidding. Strike that from the record, Cheryl.
Okay, strike. It's stricken. I'll strike and struck. There's a couple more too. There's shoot, what's it? The Doctrine of Discovery with Mark Charles and Suncha Ra. That's a great book. That's a great resource. But also Canada at a Crossroads: Boundaries, Bridges, and Laissez-Faire Racism in Indigenous Settler Relations. And it's by Jeffrey S. Dennis. And it's it was Jimmy Thunder that first talked about that book. And it talks about the different kinds of race. And it's just a really great book. So a couple more resources there. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Ray or Adrian, do you want to comment on my amazing talk, or or on each other's talk? Just kidding.
Ray said your talk was good.
That's high praise coming from the man.
No, I really appreciate your the humanity of your humor and how leveling that is for all of us, because that's what is that's the lesson of incarnation. The Anishinaabe have the creation story that humans are made last. They're the weakest and dumbest, and they need all of creation to teach them how to live. A baby born can't walk for a year and a half, can't talk for many months, but a deer within minutes can run away from a wolf. And there's another way to read Genesis 1 and 2. Because the two things we ask as Indigenous people is where you're from, who are your relatives. So Genesis 1 is a genealogy, and it leads into a geography. So the elders are all mentioned there. Elohim, which is, God, but plural. So there's mystery already. In the very first word, there's mystery. And then there's darkness, which is not spoken of in a bad way, but it's one of the old elders. And it's mystery. And light and darkness, the old elders, old teachers of ours. Sun and the moon and the stars, old elders and teachers of us all. Dry earth and the seas, teachers. The grasses, teachers. the animals, teachers, the birds, teachers. And then Creator makes human beings the weakest, dumbest thing, and then announces, now this one is going to be in charge of everything else. And I said, not only is God creator, God's comedian. Because the avian dinosaurs represented in the birds who have survived hundreds of millions of years and figured out how to survive an asteroid hit on the earth and a complete destruction, said, you're making these in charge? Are you kidding? And every animal laughed. And they start telling the story of these humans in charge. They tripped over a snake. They both tripped over a snake. And the trajectory of the Old Testament is a human hope that rises and then gets dashed to the ground. Noah saves the whole world and he gets drunk and naked. Moses delivers them out of Egypt and then he gets angry and strikes and he's thrown out of that promise. David comes along and he's got these, he's the representative of the kind of faith, and his seed will sit on his throne, and then he's messing around at the end of his life and does all kinds of stupid things. And then Solomon's the wisest person in the whole world, and everybody comes to him, and then he's 1,000 women, he's just foolish. He's the worst foolish person in the world. Trajectory of Scripture is that human hope dashed, human hope dashed, human hope dashed, until Jesus comes along. And then at the very end of his life, he takes a bowl of water and a towel, and he goes down on his knees before the disciples and he washes their feet. And he says, this is the greatest thing. And the birds said, oh, we get it now. And they bowed their knees and they recognized the greatest thing. And all the animals recognized the greatest thing. And to me, that is what, being Christ is. Not riding into the room with a crown and taking care of everything and being declared big shot, but this greatest thing of serving other people, giving your life for your brothers. And to me, that's what Christ as anonymous man is. Ray mentioned some old dead white guy who called Christ incognito. I don't know about that, but I know about this.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I like this because theology. I think there was a website that was called Theology by a bunch of old dead white guys, and that's what we have to go on, right? And in my lifetime, hearing different Indigenous theologians, thinkers, spiritual folks talk about these things, as I said in my answer to Hubert, it's been life to me. And I'm so grateful for that. I really don't think I would be here if I didn't have times like this. And Ray, you wrote an article for the Nate's Journal 100 years ago or so, give or take a couple of years, called Us Talking to Us. And I never forgot those words. I always thought, that, and anytime we were at the Many Nations One Voice with, all of these different things we've gotten to the Indigenous Roundtable in the Ottawa days, and all of those things that we've gotten to do, it's been those times where it's us talking about it, and that's where I felt like soul fed and healed, and I feel this affinity. And so I think these conversations with us as Indigenous spiritual people having these conversations is gonna maybe it's gonna maybe walk alongside some other folks. I don't like using the word help because I really feel that all that, not only what Adrian said earlier, but in my lifetime, that how can I help you? And I'm just like, I want to use some strong words when I hear that now. But so I try not to say that when I'm talking about others, even our community members who are so on the downtown east side, who are so vulnerable. I always say, I'm not trying to help, I want to walk alongside. So I feel like these talks in this video can walk alongside some other Indigenous folks, non-Indigenous folks who are interested to learn. And I'm grateful for all of you. And we've come to the end of our time now. So I don't know if anybody has any final comments you want to share, your salutations. If you want to say greetings to the Agrippa and Philippi or whoever the heck, now's your chance.
Thanks, Cheryl, for setting this up, and I'm sure that it could be helpful if people listen. So thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Hubert. Good to see you again, Adrian. I feel like a talk show host. Lauren, this could become regular. We could be our version of something. Anyways.
That's what we call the podcast, our version of something.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you. It was wonderful to be able to listen. And I feel like that's one of the major skills that we all need to learn, how to listen.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you, Cheryl, for hosting us today.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for listening with me, Hubert, being my counterpart, and Adrian and Ray. Thank you for joining us. Are you going to give a preview for what folks might listen for in a future broadcast?
Yes, I'm not sure. We'll save that for another time because I'm still fingers crossed it's all going to happen. But the reason also, I got to say, I should have said in the beginning, but the reason that Lauren and Hubert were invited here is not just as, listeners that you're Indigenous, but also you're teachers yourself, and you are the spiritual leaders and in community, and you have to have people who have the capacity to really listen, to hear the stories, and to ask good questions and to make good comments. So that's why you were invited here, because out of our respect for you guys. So thank you for that. I don't know, Adrian, any last thoughts before we sign off?
Now I'll go. It means thank you big time to everybody. It's always good to see each of you and to hear from you. And I look forward to sitting down to coffee face to face one day soon.
Yes, I like your line though. You said after you're vaccinated.
I got mine.
So we can do that. Yeah, in my language we say "Snachalia." That is a big thank you. Thank you for everything. Yeah. My uncle said when he was describing what that word means, he said, "Thank you for everything you've done in my life." So Snachalia. Bye, friends. And I'll end the recording now.